And welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Battery Insiders podcast. My name is Simon Engelke. I'm the founder and chair of Battery Associates, and I'm really excited to have a fantastic guest with us today, Niclas Lehnert, who will talk about a really important topic, which we might often don't talk about because we're very focused on batteries. And batteries, we often think about the cells and everything which comes into it. But of course, we also have to integrate these cells into systems. And there's a lot to learn about that. And there is a topic around inverters. And Niclas is working on an exciting topic related to multi-level inverters. And we hopefully today get a bit more an insight of what this actually is. I have to admit, it was a kind of a learning curve for myself when I joined some of the sessions with you guys in the past. But yeah, I hope today as a listener, you get a better idea of this technology as well, and maybe afterwards make a decision for yourself if you think this might be the next big thing. So Niclas, great to have you.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. Looking forward for the conversation.
Absolutely. So we know each other for some time, so maybe we can also kind of a bit of a, background here. I've seen you around a lot of startups and founder events, and we have been in the battery sphere, especially related to Munich, and we have been, seeing kind of, I think, both of our developments there. So I'm really excited to have you here. And today you're also here with a new brand name. I know it was Inverters, now it's Pulsetrain, and maybe we can also talk a bit about that, the founding, and also I think some of the really exciting people you brought on board to really kickstart this company and what this aim is of this Pulsetrain company to kick it off for today's episode.
Perfect. Sounds good. So jumping right into it. My name is Niclas, co-founder of Pulsetrain, currently taking over the responsibility for all the operational stuff because I myself do not have a tech background. Still was always interested in tech, even if I never was talented enough to do an engineering degree. But nevertheless, someone also has to do the operational work, which is my task in our context. And what comes with this is that I might have the ability to explain on a very high level and probably quite understandable for everyone what we're actually working on, in our case, multi-level inverters, and what the technology is about, what we can provide, and what we are especially aiming for. And our overall goal is basically to be a pioneer in revolutionary battery management and inverter technology to really reshape the e-mobility of tomorrow. And that is still a thing, even if when we are talking about electromobility, we are talking about a rather new field of mobility. But nevertheless, during the last decade, we made some really great progress in rolling out e-mobility, replacing combustion engines by electric engines, really focusing on simply rolling out and implementing electromobility. And I think we're pretty much at the end of this stage of e-mobility, or the new chapter of mobility. And now it's more time to really again focus on innovation, about improving on a technical level to provide the users, so every one of us or most of us, with a better user experience, with a better technology, and in the end reach a mass adoption of electromobility and really pushing this thing forward so that in the future we will basically only see electric cars and vehicles on the streets and no longer combustion engine vehicles.
Fantastic. So hopefully you as a listener now are intrigued. Niclas is presenting us an option to really disrupt the EV industry. And especially I think these days, right, where a lot of people maybe kind of are a bit worried that everything's already figured out and a lot of this happens actually in Asia or comes from Asia. I think it's really interesting to see this innovation we're going to talk about today. So to kick it off, for the person who's really not familiar with this topic, which I have been as well, so I can very much relate with you. So if you could maybe break down what a multi-level inverter is, in really simple terms, how it works, and why people should care about it.
Definitely, I'm happy to do so. So basically, to make it easy, we compare a conventional setup with a multi-level setup. And you need to imagine like the heart of every electric vehicle is basically the battery pack, because the energy comes from there, and it simply makes the vehicle usable for moving from A to B. And in a regular system, and in, I would say, almost all the vehicles you can currently buy in the shops, you have a three-folded system. So as a hard component, you have the battery pack, including a battery management system that is taking care of the battery cells so that you do not overcharge them, that they are operating in a safe state, and simply taking care of the battery pack. And that's the job of the battery management system. The second component you have is most likely an onboard charger, so that you are also able to charge at home in your regular AC grid. And then as a third component, you also have your inverters to basically transfer the DC energy from the battery pack to an AC signal that is then usable for the electric motor, that you are in the end able to move from A to B, because only with that you can move the vehicle. So, and in conventional systems, those battery management systems especially, they are only taking care of the battery pack as a whole. So there is almost no or only a very limited ability to really take care of the battery cells themselves as a single component. And you always need to imagine in a battery pack of an electric vehicle, and it almost doesn't matter if you're talking about a car or an e-scooter or any kind of two-wheeler, you always have several hundred, sometimes even several thousand of battery cells within the battery pack to operate it. And current battery management systems are taking care of all of them at once and treating them basically as one entity. And that is the fact because those battery cells are all wired in serial, either with copper bars or any other kind of metal, but in the end it's always a fixed connection between the battery cells. And the first and most important difference to a conventional battery management and a multi-level inverter concept is that we are now replacing those fixed connections with proactive components. So what does a proactive component mean? A proactive component in the context of a multi-level inverter is basically a very performant semiconductor. To be even a bit more precise, it's a low volt MOSFET who is taking care of the interconnection between each and every battery cell within the battery pack. And if you are now using, instead of like a fixed piece of metal, those semiconductors, then suddenly you no longer have a passive connection between the cells, but with the multi-level inverter, you have a proactive and dynamic connection between all of the cells within the battery pack. That's the first difference we need to highlight. And the second thing that is created out of this is that now you can also control and access all of those battery cells, meaning that you have a better understanding of what is the state of health, the state of charge of those battery cells, and you can use them precisely as the software component, which is also a very important part of a multi-level inverter. The software component can now control those battery cells, and with this not only has the ability to generate data, to evaluate data, but also has the ability to switch those battery cells in serial, parallel, and also bypass in a more or less arbitrary way, so that you are now also able to, without having an onboard charger, synchronize on almost any incoming signal, AC, DC, fast charging, slow charging, you name it. And at the same time, you're also able to generate a sine wave, meaning an AC signal for the motor straight from your battery pack without using an inverter, because when you have a proactive dynamic connection between the battery cells, what you are creating in simple words is a battery matrix, and this matrix is controlled by the software component, who is then taking care of the functionality of powering the motor, charging the battery cells, and at the same time monitoring the battery cells so that they are always operating in a safe state, and even more important, in an optimum state. And that is the major difference between a multi-level inverter and a conventional battery management system. Replacing passive components by proactive components and creating a dynamic interconnection between battery cells, and with this removing the onboard charger and the inverter from the overall system.
Well, that sounds really exciting. And just to kind of understand this, so it means you really don't need these two other inverters. You only need the BMS in the end. That's
correct.
True?
So it always depends what is your direction you are coming from. You could either say that it is a battery management system with a included inverter functionality, or if you come from the other side, it is an inverter with an included battery management ability.
I like how you bring everyone with us, take everyone with us. So, okay, great. So I guess that sounds quite attractive, right? So we can get rid of some components. You have some new capabilities there. But I guess now the question is, why hasn't this happened yet? What are the challenges? And also maybe why is it time now, right? I mean, I've seen recently also other news from Porsche with some demos, and suddenly a lot of people talking about it. I know you're probably also involved in that conversation and trying to get this conversation going. But also I know you've been on this for some time. So what has been blocking it, and why do you think now is the right time?
In the past, one major thing that has been blocking the technology for really being implemented into an industrial application, into like a user experience part, is that for our setup, you need a quite specific kind of semiconductors, which are able to handle a very low voltage, but a quite high current. So that was a requirement no one was actually caring about in the past. And for that reason, like the semiconductor producers, were also not really interested in developing such semiconductors or even selling them because there was simply no demand. And then suddenly, like also roughly 10 years ago, the topic of crypto mining came into the game. And with this quite like a quite specific type of graphic cards. And those graphic cards need exactly the type of semiconductor we also need, like low voltage, high current ability. And that was more or less also a Kickstarter for our technology, because then suddenly the semiconductor producers had on stock off-the-shelf semiconductors that can also be used in our context. And with this, the price like significantly dropped for those components. Because obviously before this time, you could buy such semiconductors, develop them, but they would have been super expensive because you are the sole and only user of them. So no one is really interested in going into an economy of scale. For that reason, the system would be super, super expensive. And for this reason, simply not competitive, no matter how much better you are on the tech side. So the development of a new type of semiconductor in a large scale was one enabler that was missing in the past that we have now. And a second very important thing is, or a barrier that we needed to overcome, was that, as I already said in the beginning, during the last decade, we've been quite focused on simply getting electric cars to the street and to the customer. And there was not so much a focus on really optimizing on the tech side. So we've been using and still using off-the-shelf technology that has been proven to work in the past. And now we are more moving and heading into the direction that we are optimizing on a tech level to really improve the user experience and the technological abilities of those electric vehicles. And that's why I think we have quite a good timing to now move into the direction and to now bring the multi-level inverter technology into the market, because we have the components now. We have now the right timing that the OEMs and the tier ones are more focusing on the tech side again. And for this reason, I think the timing is quite right, the technology is quite right, and also the components are quite right to now have not only a tech competitive, but also a cost competitive system. And a third very important point is, as a multi-level converter always is a very close connection between hardware and software. This is also something, especially in the Western hemisphere and the Western OEMs, these are two fields of know-how that are rarely coming together, especially if you really need to connect them. And that is also something that is still, I would say, a kind of a challenge that some of the OEMs have to really build expertise and to build know-how, especially on the software side. And that also helps us a lot because we are quite good in this field. And I would say we're even better in connecting those two components, hardware and software, to then get to a multi-level inverter and to really optimize on a system and tech level.
When you just brought up three interesting points, I think, for our listeners. So one, there's something else we can thank crypto for. So, establishing, which is interesting, right? So, I mean, I know there's people very interested in crypto. It seems like crypto has this good side benefit, potentially enabling this technology you're developing. The second, the topic of iteration in the automotive sector. It's very much something also through our work we're seeing that, the first, if you're if you're a car company, you're building your first EV, right? You're probably just trying to get it to work. So you don't really have the bandwidth to kind of do all of these other iterations and modifications. But then, as you say, now that actually there are first generations are out there, these automotives are looking into what does the next generation look like? How can they improve? And of course, one of this is also on the cell side, right? Like solid state and these things. They're trying to see if they can make it work. But also, as you say now, and I can believe that, is also looking like, how can you improve the system? And we already have seen other interesting developments on the system side. So I think there's an interesting timing to make sense. And then, as you said, the hardware software side working together. I think, yeah, it's a really difficult thing. I think
It is.
so. I think, yeah, I can see how this is a challenge, but I can also see how if you bring it together, it can really make it effective.
Absolutely. Can't agree more.
Perfect. So now let's go a bit more into the topic, maybe more in depth, right? So I think one is interesting, and again, my team was also looking through your website and your new exciting claims. So let's go into some of them. So I mean, there's one topic of 80% extension of battery life, which is something which was brought up, and also here topic of AI, and of course we have to talk about AI in this time of the world, and it's another important topic. So how can you achieve that? Maybe also interesting how does AI potentially play a role here, and then also anything you can share on algorithm data, anything in that regards.
So starting with the lifetime extension, again, I will more or less compare a conventional with the multi-level systems. In the conventional systems, as you're treating all the battery cells which are within the pack pretty much the same, because in the first place, you don't really have access to them to treat them differently. And in the second place, you also do not really have precise information what are the precise differences between those battery cells. That leads to the fact that you're always treating them the same. But that also leads to the fact that you always need to take care of the weakest cell within your system. And to make a very extreme example, which will rarely be a real life example, but just to make it to highlight how it works, let's assume that you have 1,000 battery cells within your battery pack. 199 of them are still at 100% capacity, and only a single one is at 75%. Then in most of the cases, you need to take care of this one single battery cell, and you are no longer able to charge to 100% capacity, but the whole pack can only be charged to 75% because you simply need to take care of the single weak point within the system. So that was quite an extreme example. In the reality, it rather looks like this, that all of those battery cells within your pack will have a slightly different state of health and state of charge because of an environmental impact or because of a production failure, even if it's only a minor one. So they are not perfectly the same over the whole battery pack. And that leads to the fact that they are aging differently or in a different pace, meaning that at a certain point you will have quite some difference between the maximum capacity within the overall battery pack. And as you always need to take care of those weakest cells within the system, in this case, they are defining your end of life. Because taking the automotive context, on average, we can say that when you reach a 75 to 80% left capacity, you could define the vehicle as used up and no longer be applicable for an automotive application. And the point of time when you reach this is again only on average, there is outliers in both directions, reached at roughly 10 to 12 years for current cars which are on the street. Newer generations are performing better, but on average you can calculate with 10 to 12 years. And that is simply because batteries are aging in a different pace. And what we can do now, and this is where the lifetime extension comes into the game, as we can really take care of those single cells and really can take care of what is the actual demand on how to treat a specific battery cell, we can make sure that the aging process is distributed almost perfectly over the whole battery pack. So you will have almost no differences between the aging state of single cells, which means that in the end, if you have a look at the timeline, the point of time when you reached your 75 to 80% simply is reached on a later point because all of the cells are aging in a similar way, meaning that you can simply move the time or the point of time when you reach your 75 to 80%. That is one point. And the second point, and this is where AI comes into the game, this is not simply possible because we have access to the battery cells, but this is also true because we can understand them. And to understand a battery cell, you basically need data. In the best case, a lot of data, as in most of the AI models. So whenever a car is operated, or any electric vehicle that is using a multi-level inverter, when it's operated, the battery pack is constantly generating battery data. And this battery data, in the best of all worlds, can then be first collected, being sent up to the cloud in a regular pace, in the cloud being evaluated, and then, and that's also a major difference to comparable conventional systems, we can then use the learnings from the patterns and the data we had, which are then run through the algorithms. We can use these results, send them back to the individual vehicle you are currently using, and with this, making sure that the battery pack is always operating in the optimum state for your individual pack. And that is a huge difference to conventional systems, because even if they have the ability to generate data, they never have the ability to really proactively change something in the operational state on the individual vehicle or even on the fleet. So that also helps us to slow down this aging process, as we can always make sure that the battery pack and the battery cells are operated in the optimum state they are currently demanding. So that is the point where AI comes into the game. And that is important because as you have a huge bunch of data, and to really see what patterns and what results you get, that basically needs to be done by AI, and that basically needs to be done by models who are then operating and optimizing the algorithms and in the end the battery management software that is then implemented on those individual cars. And that's where the topic of AI also comes into the game.
Okay, very cool. And just to fully understand also for our listeners, so when people are aware of like cell balancing, right? Very simple form. You want to keep on the same voltage level, etc. So what you're saying now is, and that's something you can do, right? Just a normal system, but later, equalize it. And then, but what you're saying now is that if you now notice there is a cell which does worse, right? Like degrade it more, as you said, it's, 10%, whatever worse than the other ones. Now you could, for example, apply less of a current as a simplification.
Exactly. So you can really individually take care of at which exact moment this battery cell is used. And if we take as an example, like a standard driver's case, going on a highway with a more or less constant speed, then we can really choose which ones we're using at a specific moment. And for this reason, making sure that the weaker cells are used less often and the stronger cells are used more often.
Okay, nice. And then I guess there's two questions to that, right? So one is, like, what's the state currently on this, right? Like, how much do you have data already available, like showing this, right? That you can, for example, extend the life. And then, and that's actually one interesting point. I went to a multi-level inverter event where one of your other co-founders was speaking. And there was this discussion about by another company, more on the industrial side application, how there isn't really data available for cells, like, on degradation for this kind of use cases, because normally people are very used to charge discharge. But now what you're doing is not really a test protocol for most even cell makers, right? So like, how do you deal with that? And what's maybe the data or like the insights you have so far on that?
Yeah. So basically, there is lots of research ongoing who really wants to dive deeper into the topic. I can only recommend Professor Lehnkamp from the Technical University in Munich, who's doing some great research. There is also Professor Wei from the University of Federal Armed Forces here in Munich, who's also doing some great research. And that's, by the way, also the institute we spinned off from. And of course, my co-founder, Dr. Manuel Kuder, who's publishing a lot into this direction. And there is lots of simulations ongoing in the research sector, showing lifetime extensions between 60 to 80, sometimes even go beyond the 80%. And we are currently at a state that we have our first real-life prototype up and running, and are now checking on real-life data what are the actual results. And as long as the results are not, or the tests are ongoing, I would not lean too wide out of the window. But the first results we've been evaluating are definitely going into the same direction as the research in the past has shown. So we are now not only relying on the research side, but we are really testing in real life or in real life lab conditions for a specific use case already. Definitely showing that the outlook and the promises can be kept. So that is one side. And then, of course, besides now like the German ecosystem, there is also plenty of other research institutions, also in the US, who are taking care of this. And when it comes to the set of data, I totally agree that they are almost not available. And that is also why we needed to first create a baseline of available data, not only current, voltage, and temperature, for example, which are, I would say, the standards you're measuring. But what we can do additionally, I'm not going to dive too deep into this, but the intrinsic ability of a multi-level inverter is also to not only get a DC signal over the batteries, but also get a pulse signal, which you can more or less imagine like an AC signal you're pumping through your battery. And when you're doing this, then you are getting a specific response from it. And this specific response also gives you a result, which is called a Nyquist plot, just that I've said it. But the result and the shape of those outcomes also gives you a very precise understanding of what is currently going on within this battery cell. And that is something we are additionally using and also tracking to get a better understanding and to create those sets of data that are necessary to really optimize on a data perspective.
Cool. Okay, now just thinking this further, right? So now you have this technology, and then you said on the extension of lifetime. Another one is like maybe more extreme situations such rapid acceleration, hypercars, and maybe also vehicle grid as another application, which is a big one as well, where inverters I know is also a big topic. And the inverters actually have some challenges there as well, because they optimize maybe for one of the application, more the fast charging or more on the lower current for houses. So yeah, maybe if you could share a bit more, also like temperature fluctuation, anything else where this could be helpful.
Yeah. The multi-level inverters as the functionality side is way more defined by software compared to regular systems, gives you the opportunity to make the system way more flexible when it also comes to like non-driving applications. As you already said, for example, vehicle to grid, vehicle to home applications, because in the end, only the software is defining in like which direction power and energy is floating. So if you have a multi-level inverter, your system itself is intrinsically bidirectional, and not only with like 3 or 3.5 kilowatts, but with the full motor power. So you can imagine if you have, for example, 100 kilowatt motor within your vehicle, then, at least in theory, you also have the ability to feed back energy or electricity to the grid or to your house with a power level of 100 kilowatts. I'm absolutely aware that most of the plugs are not able to handle such high power levels. Same is true for the discharging C rates of the battery cells. But in the end, you do not longer need to take care of bidirectional onboard chargers and then like transferring energy and having several interfaces which are always connected to losses and inefficiency. With the multi-level inverter, you are per se always bidirectional with your full power, making it way more interesting to like really integrate vehicles into the public grid and also into your home grid, because you simply have the power available that makes a difference in such an application. That is one thing. And a second very important thing, especially when we have a look at the sustainability aspect, is that also when we talk about second life applications, currently you need to remove the battery pack. You need to open it up, you need to remove the battery cells, you need to rematch them, you need to put a new battery management system on top of them. Basically, you need to build a new battery pack before you are ready to reuse them in a second life application. Takes time, is expensive because it takes time and the process is not very lean. For this reason, second life applications are currently not really competitive with first life applications because in most of the cases, they're simply more expensive because of that. If you have a multi-level inverter in your battery pack, the only thing you need to do is remove your battery pack, update the software so that the software now knows, okay, I'm in a new application. I need to be a stationary storage, for example, and you're good to go. No hardware adjustments, no rematching. That makes it way, way easier and way more realistic to reuse those battery packs coming from the mobility sector, for example. And for the customer, the vehicle user, currently, if you want to resell an electric car, you might face quite a hard time because the person who's buying it can never be sure what is the exact state of health of your battery pack. Is it 87%? Is it 97%? Is it 90%? No one really exactly knows what it is. And with a multi-level inverter, you have always an almost perfect indication of what is the maximum capacity this battery pack can deliver to you. And with this, you also have the ability to define a decent price and a realistic price when you resell it. So for you as a user, that makes it way easier to, on one side, buy a used car, and on the other side to resell your used car.
Okay, I can see that. And maybe that's also a bit of thing on the application side, right? So, and I think there's two other companies, and I guess it's the Munich ecosystem, right? I think one thing said is Munich probably has one place in the world right now where most people talk about multi-level, and that's probably Munich, right? Based on also what you mentioned with the academic rigor, etc., in this field. There's two other companies I've come across, and I know you know them well too, and have been at joint events, etc. Stable, which I think is more on the second life for stationary, also using multi-level, which I'm aware. And then you also have another one, Instagrid, right, which is for power. So another two applications, right? Of course, I would think that EV is the big one, right? Like that's where everyone wants to go, but also probably one of the hardest ones. So, props that you're going in there now, or like focusing on that. You mentioned the topic of costs, right? And that's, I think, also another big challenge, I would think, right? Because you have all of these, even though it maybe got cheaper now through crypto, but it's still, a lot of kind of, controllers you have to put into each of the cells. So do you think this will be something which starts also as like hypercars and any application that doesn't make sense? Or do you think actually from a price standpoint, this is possible to go into more wider mass adoption vehicles rather quickly?
Actually, our first and probably most obvious thought was that if you're not looking into stationary, then in mobility, what is the most obvious case? Of course, automotive. You can see it every day. You're using it likely every day. A huge market, an obvious market, but as you already said, an extremely complex market with extremely high entry barriers. And that's what we also experienced because, and especially in the context of cost, they are very sensitive. And that also leads to the fact that you either have the chance to go over the premium and high performance segments, so like the really expensive, really like performance cars, or the other way would be to create a proof of market in another segment that is not the automotive, so like the non-automotive market, and to prove that the technology is working, that it's cost competitive, like also using the momentum of having first systems in the market to drive costs down. And we actually decided to go for the second option. So to rather focus on a market that is outside of the automotive market, namely the construction market, because what we have seen there is that the cost pressure from a system perspective is not as high as in the automotive case, because the OEMs and especially the users of those machines, they rather calculate on a total cost of ownership. So the longer you can use the vehicle, the cheaper it gets for them, the more efficient it gets for them. So the initial price is not that important for them. For this reason, the cost component is a bit less intense or a bit less important. And the second thing is that as the overall performance indicators of those vehicles, even if they appear huge, they most of the time have a way lower power level than every conventional electric car on the market, which makes it for new technology also from a tech perspective a bit easier to get implemented and to get really a use case shaped out of your innovative development. So we currently decided to first create a proof of market in the construction sector. That's also why we visited the Bauma last week in Munich, which was quite successful. with lots of new and interesting leads and operate first on this market for non-automotive and construction machines before we then, in a second step, like really move into the direction of automotive with a better cost performance for sure, and also with more learnings and more proof of markets or more proof points in the market that the technology is working, is reliable, and tearing down a bit the fear of some OEMs to really make the first step and to maybe invest into an unreliable system, which it's definitely not.
I think that's smart. I think a lot of people, and of course, especially in the venture funded world, right, you always look at the biggest total addressable market, TAM. And of course, automotive is usually the one people love just from the size. But as you say, it's just such a difficult market to go in. So I think having a market, right, where you can more easily enter and get your learnings and build up the credibility and establish your technology, and then you can, right, aim for the big one, the automotive. Of course, from an VC standpoint, people want to see that you can get there eventually, right, if it all goes well. But I think having a market to entry strategy on a market which is more easily accessible makes a lot of sense. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And now a question on another aspect is the weight. We saw something on our team on your website about the weight reduction through a system. And I think there was something mentioned about 40%, which sounds rather ambitious. So I'd love to hear about how and why.
When it comes to the weight reduction, we are always comparing the multi-level inverter from our side to a regular powertrain, excluding the motor, because we can't replace that one. So we are always comparing the onboard charger, the regular battery management, and the inverter weight to what the multi-level inverter is providing. And as we are combining all of those three components into one component, that leads to a weight reduction, still having in mind that we are also an electronics component ourselves. But overall, you can save, compared to a regular onboard charger, BMS, and inverter, up to those 40%. In numbers spoken or in kilograms spoken, this means on average roughly 15 kilos you're saving on the powertrain side, simply because you're combining those components.
Okay, that's quite significant. Talking about advancements on the cell infrastructure, cell structure, and also on the system structure and how our systems are set up. There's a lot of talk also about like cell to pack, right? Is this something which would actually help your case or be more challenging?
I would actually say the multi-level inverter is helping this case. Because if you're talking about a cell-to-pack approach, that's non-repairable. That's a throwaway concept in the end, because whenever you have like a minor failure, the pack is done because you can't remove or repair anything within it. So we rather see this if you have such a concept, which definitely has some advantages. That's why it is done. But if you're going into such a direction, you should make sure that you can take care of this battery pack and that you can still operate it, even in case if you have failures or like any problem within it, without replacing the whole pack. And that's why I would say the concept of cell to pack or even cell to or pack to chassis only makes sense or provides the advantages it should be if you have a multi-level inverter or a system that can handle certain levels of failure, so that you are not forced to replace the whole pack, or like if you have cell to chassis, even remove the whole car if you have a cell failure.
Interesting. Yeah. Again, there's some interesting developments, so definitely going to keep an eye on that. Another aspect is you mentioned earlier also in just overcoming, right, some of the challenges of some cells which are maybe not doing too well. Of course, there's a lot, right? And we have seen this also in the last years of, big cell makers like CATL, and where they go the PPM, they want to go into like extreme high levels of quality, meaning, that this ideally shouldn't happen. Question, is it ever possible, right? You probably always have some challenges due to, all kinds of errors which can be introduced, but let's say it's getting less and less over time for cell makers. So is there like a risk for you that at some point cells are too perfect and you don't need this, advanced kind of, different use, like advanced use of each of the cell and like being, because they're all the perfect the same. So there's no overhead like this.
I would say, as we are still talking about chemical systems, which are like extremely complex whenever you scale them, I do not really see a high risk by simply being obsolete because the cells are so perfect. Because in the end, when the cells are perfect, that likely means that they are more cost driven, or that they're simply more expensive than cells with a lower quality. So whenever you have the ability to produce perfect cells, that would be in general quite great from a production perspective. Nevertheless, whenever you're applying them to a battery pack and to a final application, your environmental influences, so heat, cold, the user in the end, if this is not also perfect, and you can't make sure that the temperature is always perfect and that you will never have a temperature difference within your pack, whenever this comes into the game, no matter how perfect your cells has been in the past or from production perspective, the aging process is still driven by plenty of indicators and by plenty of variables, making it still important to have a system that can handle those differences and can handle those variables. So I would say it would be good if we can produce high quality cells in a high number, even to lower cost. But that doesn't necessarily makes a good battery management system obsolete, because you still have those environmental factors and all the variables that are coming into the game whenever you applied your battery cell.
Okay, it sounds like you have a hope there. So that's good. But I mean, it makes sense. I mean, a bit of a challenging question here. But I guess another aspect is related to applications we haven't talked about yet is electric aviation. We had another podcast guest, Lord Adair Turner, who has a bet with me in the audience, the full audience, that by 2070, we're going to have electric aviation mid-long range. And unfortunately, probably won't, at least in his own words, he won't be around then so we can, settle the bet. But we have this bet standing. So I guess a question for you, any thoughts? I know also Munich had a lot of electric aviation approaches. Unfortunately, a lot of challenges there more recently, but also in other regions like China and other places, there's still developments we're also seeing. So yeah, maybe you could touch on this topic. Is this helping also? Because weight reduction and power improvement both sounds to me like aviation as well.
Another point that is very important for aviation is the redundancy. So whenever you have a sail failure, I mean, in the car or whenever you're on the ground, you can simply stop the vehicle and like get off it. If you're in the air, getting off is maybe a bit challenging whenever you have a cell or a system failure. So the redundancy that a multi-level inverter can provide is definitely also a benefit that perfectly fits into electric aviation. Nevertheless, why we have decided against this market as an entry market is that the regulations and the entry barriers, at least for like the commercial aviation, are even higher than in the automotive case. Your development cycles and certification cycles, they are extremely challenging. Even big companies like Airbus or Boeing or MTU are facing a significant challenge to implement new technologies, even if it's only a screw they are replacing. So that is a market that is definitely very interesting and where a multi-level inverter definitely provides a lot of advantages the sector is looking for. Nevertheless, for us as Pulsetrain, it's a market that might be third or even as a fourth option to move into, simply because it's a complex industry with high demands on quality and technology and also certification. So for that reason, we prefer and we decided to first stay on the ground before we go and head for the sky.
Again, I think another smart approach, but yeah, good to hear that there could be something in that market too. Maybe it's the last market where we see a lot of traction with battery associates, but also through battery MBA or executive training and other initiatives we're running, is the best, right? Like stationary batteries industry. There's a lot of, excitement about that because again, there's interesting business cases on that in Europe, but also in North America and elsewhere. So Yeah, maybe if you could share a bit on that and also the aspect of fire safety, because that's one thing which is also concerning the BESS industry, of course, also in automotive and others. But yeah, if maybe you could share on these two topics, one, what could help on the stationary side, but also the fire safety side.
I will start with the fire safety side. First and foremost, whenever you have better data and more precise data, it's easier for you to predict or to see whenever there is anomalies within your data that might lead to a thermal runaway in the worst case. And as we have more data and also more precise data, for us it's easier to find those patterns and to predict a thermal runaway earlier than a conventional system could do this. That is one point why I would say we are better off at this point. And a second very important point is that whenever you have a multi-level inverter, you have the ability, when you notice, okay, this battery is going into a critical state quite fast, to kind of short circuit the battery cell, meaning that you can remove immediately almost 1/3 of the energy that is within this battery cell, because the energy is in the end the reason why it's taking fire or why it's catching fire. So with this approach of short circuiting, and that's like only a very high level explanation, in detail it's a bit more complex. But with this approach, you can take away 1/3 of the energy that would also add to a thermal runaway immediately, being left with the chemical energy that is stored within the battery cell. But still, if you remove the 1/3, the thing what you get from this is that you are simply adding time to tell your user, okay, the battery is in a critical state already. You should now leave your vehicle because the likelihood of catching fire is extremely high. So please stop and walk away. And whenever you are gaining time for this information and for the user to move away, that can in the end save lives, because even if the user is in an accident and is no longer able to move, every second you can add on the timeline that makes an event of catching fire from the battery side moving into the future gives a firefighter or any kind of rescue unit the chance to save you from the situation, and in the end could lead to or could make the difference between surviving or not surviving such an accident. So that is one point we can do to that. And also, as such a thermal event, if you're not talking about an accident, is very likely to show up very early in the data set. You can already tell the user that he should maybe see a workshop because there is something going wrong within his battery pack, simply because a regular battery would change over time quite slowly. But whenever you see that there is a quite fast change, even within a week, that is a quite critical indicator that something is crucially wrong with your battery cell. And if you then have this data and can transfer the data to an information to the user, you simply have the ability to tell him beforehand and before the event is really happening.
Brilliant. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. There's many other topics I'd like to talk about, maybe like solid state and others, and how this can all play a role. But maybe, people have to find you and ask you these questions directly, or bring them up in the comments here. And if you're on Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else where you listen to this podcast, and I can ask them directly and try to get you some answers. I'm sure Niclas is happy to provide some additional insights, or on LinkedIn, if you listen to this or you found it through LinkedIn, comment as well there. But yeah, for today, Niclas, I don't know if there's anything else you want to share. Otherwise, we can wrap it up.
No, we can wrap it up. It was very nice talking to you, and I hope we could give a good overview on how multi-level inverters are working. And as Simon said, whenever you have a question, reach out to me directly. I'm always happy to connect.
Fantastic. Yeah, I definitely learned a lot. Again, I think you did a great job on explaining multi-level inverters a bit more. So yeah, hopefully you found it interesting as well. Again, reach out to Niclas if you have more questions about the technology, or reach out to me as well. And then, yeah, please subscribe and like the Spotify or YouTube or Apple podcast or anywhere else you listen to this podcast, so we make sure it reaches more people as well. But again, for today, thanks so much. This was Simon Engelke with Battery Associates, and thank you all for listening.